Hello, everyone. Welcome to this virtual meeting. I see that some of you have just joined us. We're still a minute or two before 6 o'clock, so we'll give people another 4 or 5 minutes or so, and then we'll get underway shortly. So if you could just sit tight, that would be much appreciated. Thank you for joining us. Hello again, everyone. I see that some others have joined us just in the last minute or two. It's just about 6:30 right now. We'll give people another couple of minutes and then we will get underway. Thank you for joining us. If you'd sit tight, that would be terrific. Okay, why don't we get underway? We were expecting a few others. Hopefully they can join us in progress. Let me begin by saying good evening, everyone, and welcome to this virtual meeting about the Town of Collingwood's service allocation policy and land use study and the related water and wastewater allocation framework and associated recommendations. And thank you so very much for taking time out of your busy schedules. I know there's a lot of things that compete for your time and your attention, and your interest in our topic, your interest in your community, your interest in the town of Collingwood is much appreciated. Some of you have heard me say this before, but I think it bears repeating. I do a fair bit of this kind of work, and it's my personal belief that people who like yourselves, who take time out of your busy personal and professional lives to contribute constructively to matters of civic and community interest are always most deserving of our gratitude and respect. So thank you again for joining us, and I look forward, as I'm sure do you, to a productive and informative session. Now, for those of you whom I've not yet met, let me introduce myself. My name is Glenn Pache. I'm the head of a firm called GLPI, and it's my pleasure to serve as the independent facilitator for the meeting. So again, it might be important for you to know that I am not an employee of the town, nor am I an employee of any of the planning or engineering firms that have been retained to assist with this initiative. The only bias I bring to the meeting, if you can call it a bias, is toward achieving the best result for us all. And again, my role is simply to serve as the moderator, the independent facilitator for the session. Now, as you may know, there are two sessions that were held today. There was an earlier one, which was comprised primarily of developers, and then there is this one, which is more public focused in nature. And I will note that the town, in the interest of openness and transparency, made the links for both meetings available to everyone. So we did have some members of the public who were at the earlier meeting, and of course I would expect that there will be some developers and or their representatives at this meeting. But I will note to the development community that this session is designed for, is primarily focused on informing the public about the proposed framework, and please keep that in mind this evening. So before we go any further, let me share a respectful land acknowledgement. For more than 15,000 years, the First Nations walked upon and cared for the lands we now call home. Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and many others who were families, friends, and communities, the way we are today. The town of Collingwood acknowledges the Lake Simcoe Nottawasaga Treaty of 1818 and the relationship it establishes with the original inhabitants of Turtle Island. And we acknowledge the reality of our shared history and the current contributions of Indigenous people within our community. We seek to continue empowering expressions of pride amongst all of the diverse stakeholders in this area, and we seek to do better and to continue to recognize, learn, and grow in friendship and community, nation to nation. So let's talk a little bit about what it is that we are up to tonight. And you'll hear more about this in a few minutes, but as I think everyone knows, the town passed an interim control bylaw that put a pause on certain development pending the creation of a framework for allocating water and wastewater capacity. And this session is about sharing that draft framework and some of the related recommendations. And of course, it's also about getting your feedback on that draft framework. And there'll be an opportunity for you to share that feedback, to ask questions of factor clarification and so forth. In essence, this session is focused on information sharing. Now, more specifically, let me quickly walk you through the session agenda, and I'll try to do this fairly quickly. First, we will hear from Town of Collingwood staff, who will provide a few words of welcome and some additional context. Next, we'll move to an overview presentation by Meridian Planning Consultants, which is the lead firm assisting the town with the study. And that presentation will speak to the background of the initiative, the steps leading up to this point in the process. We'll also hear about the purpose and the content of the allocation policy, what's covered in it, what's not covered by it. We'll hear about timing and expiry related issues. We'll hear about the proposed approach, including capacity allocation criteria and recommended weightings. We'll hear about the implications for zoning, the implications for the town's official plan, and of course, there'll be a description of next steps and where things go from here. Following the presentation, we will open things up again to questions of factor clarification and, of course, any comments that you might want to share on what's being proposed. Please note, and again, this is important, please note that we are not, I repeat, we are not addressing individual site or property specific questions today. Those are best addressed through other means and other forms. But I also wanted to mention that we don't just want to tell you stuff. The town also wants to get your thoughts on a few things. And in fact, the latter part of the session will focus on getting your perspectives on a variety of questions and issues, and more about how we'll do that a little bit later. And then we'll conclude with any observations from town staff and a kind of recap or reiteration of next steps, followed by a formal closing and adjournment. And we'll be looking to wrap things up by about 8 o'clock or so. A couple of process-related items. First, please note that this meeting is being recorded, and that's being done for two reasons. One is to have the session content available to be shown to those who may not have been able to join us tonight. But secondly, to have a record of the proceedings that staff and others can access and mine for, I'm sure, what will be a good conversation that's upcoming. We will also occasionally this evening be making use of some electronic polling questions to which you are invited to respond if you have a web-enabled device, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I mentioned that we're looking to hear from participants. Depending on the number of people who are interested in sharing questions, comments, observations, we may not get to everybody this evening, but be assured that there are other avenues available to you for sharing your valued comments and perspective. So again, if we don't happen to get to you this evening, be assured there are other options. For example, you can visit engage.collingwood.ca to access study-related information and share your comments. You can also send them by email to planning@collingwood.ca. Again, that's planning@collingwood.ca. These addresses will be up on a slide a little bit later if you haven't been able to capture them right now. And of course, written comments are being accepted up until December 3rd. So, roughly a couple of weeks from now. Now, this next part, I know that the good people at Collingwood share this sentiment, but I'll just say quickly, I'll note quickly that the mayor and council, as well as myself, feel very strongly about the importance of civility and respectful dialogue. And I'm sure that that will be the case this evening, but just a quick reminder to everyone about that. Now, by the way, I also understand that we have a number of our esteemed elected officials and various senior town staff who are observing the session this evening. We are very pleased to have them join us. I know that they will be keen listeners to the conversation, and welcome to all of them. And again, thank you for your interest in this initiative. Now, I'll say a few more things later about the nature of this Zoom webinar and how you can participate, in particular when we get to the part of the session where we're looking to open things up to your comments and questions and observations. But as mentioned, we will begin by hearing from town staff, who will share a few words of welcome and some additional context. And to that end, it is my pleasure to hand things over to Summer Valentine, who is the town's Director of Planning, Building, and Economic Development. Again, welcome everybody. Great to have you join us. Summer, over to you.
Thank you, Glenn, and good evening to everybody. I am relatively new to the town of Collingwood, but I do recognize a number of names on our participant list today. So hello to those I've met. To those I haven't met, I look forward to doing so in the very near future. I welcome and thank Glenn for providing this opportunity to provide a few opening words from town staff. We'd like to first start by welcoming everyone who's attended today and thank you for spending the time out of your busy schedules to provide some feedback and comments on this important initiative. And if I could take a few moments to provide some additional context so we're all starting from the same page. As the vast majority of you on the call likely are aware, and as Glenn noted in his introductory remarks, the town passed an interim control bylaw when the capacity limits of the water treatment plant were identified. And that bylaw temporarily pauses developments while solutions are explored. While the bylaw is still in place, there are several exemptions that have taken place and have been approved for shovel-ready projects that are moving forward in 2021 and early 2022. The interim control bylaw is set to expire in April of 2022, and therefore the town did move quickly to begin a study to address issues from the land use planning perspective. Staff and the town's consultant, which is Meridian Planning, who will be presenting today, are working hard to complete the land use planning policy study by the end of this year to allow us some time to move forward towards providing an appropriate implementation plan so that we can hit the ground running in April. The study is intended to provide a fair and transparent framework for allocation of water and wastewater capacity in a way that would achieve the community's vision and be in line with good planning principles. In our research, Meridian Planning has reviewed best practices from across Ontario and will be presenting today a preliminary multi-pronged policy and regulatory-based framework for servicing capacity allocation in the town of Collingwood. As a very high level remark, it's important to note that the combined effect of the recommendations that are going to be presented today would be to transition away from a first come, first serve to a merit-based model of capacity allocation. It bears repeating that this is a major project for the town, and it's critical that we collectively get it right to achieve a balance between supporting appropriate growth and protecting the town's interests in ensuring sufficient water and wastewater capacity is available to new developments and redevelopment projects that foster a complete and healthy community. So your input this evening on these preliminary documents and recommendations will be invaluable in refining the products as we bring forward an approach that's appropriate, implementable, and sustainable. Thank you for the opportunity again, Glenn, and I look forward to joining the conversation when you open the floor for a question and answer period.
Great, thank you, Summer. And I note that the slide says, welcome to the webinar. It will begin shortly. Be assured that we have started. We began at 6:30. And for those of you who may have joined us in progress, again, my name is Glenn Pache. I'm serving as the independent facilitator for the session. And you've just been listening to Summer Valentine from the town of Collingwood. So now, as mentioned, we'll share an overview presentation covering all of the kinds of topics I mentioned earlier. I won't repeat them, but it's everything from the background to the initiative to the actual framework itself and the points allocation and all of that sort of stuff. And it's my pleasure now to hand things over to Nick McDonald, who is again the president of Meridian Planning Consultants, one of the firms that is assisting the town with the study. I will note that Nick has some interactive polling questions that are embedded in his presentation. You'll be invited to participate by providing your answers. However, those connecting through a simple non-smartphone will not be able to participate in the polls. But as I'm checking, I don't think that's the case for any of our attendees tonight. So you should all be able to do it with the devices that you're using, which is great. But Nick, over to you to take us through the bulk of the presentation.
Great. Thanks a lot, Glenn, for that introduction. And thanks, Summer, as well, for setting the stage for this presentation this evening. Can we advance the slide, please? So as mentioned, my name is Nick McDonald. I'm the president of Meridian Planning Consultants. I'm a registered professional planner with over 30 years of experience. The purpose of this session today is to present our preliminary recommendations on a go-forward water and wastewater allocation policy framework. Our recommendations on needed changes to the zoning bylaw and optional changes to the official plan will also be presented as well. And I very much, along with the rest of the team at the town, look forward to your comments on our preliminary recommendations. As many in the session are aware, and as Summer indicated, an interim control bylaw is currently in place. The intent of that bylaw was to pause development until the town develops the framework that we're going to be talking about this evening. The interim control bylaw will expire on April 26th, 2022. Once the allocation framework is finalized, it will then be relied upon to make decisions as the town continues to grow. And as many on this call are aware, considerable growth is expected in Collingwood to 2051. As also mentioned by Summer, my firm was retained early on in June 2021 to complete the land use study. So we're going to do our first polling question to get a feel for who is attending tonight's session. So question one, which I will read: in the context of the town of Collingwood, are you, and then select the option that best describes you given your relationship to the project. Are you a developer, development agent? That means a planner, engineer, project manager, realtor, business owner, resident, a member of a stakeholder group, or other. I see most people are putting in their answers, which is great. We've got about 17 participants in today's session. And based on a good majority of those responses, it looks like the majority of folks tonight are residents, which is great. The majority of the folks we had this afternoon were in the development industry. Okay, great. Thanks for that. Please advance the slide. So in terms of our work, we first completed a best practices review that focused on the nature, scope, and level of detail of policies dealing with allocation and other official plans. We also looked at the approach to the allocation of water and wastewater in council-endorsed allocation policy documents, with these policies sitting outside of the official plan, meaning that they're non-statutory and simply endorsed by council. We also looked at the types of performance measures used in other jurisdictions that need to be met in order to obtain allocation. And when I say performance measures, that means what criteria need to be satisfied to actually obtain the allocation of a scarce resource, at least in the short term. We also looked at the timing of the allocation commitment and for how long allocation is given. And this is important, particularly when services are finite, again, at least in the short term. We also reviewed financing and fiscal components of capacity allocation as well. Next slide. So we have prepared a draft allocation policy that we're going to be presenting this evening and looking for comments on. The intent of our recommended policy is to ensure the capacity is allocated in a sustainable, transparent, and orderly manner. And when I say sustainable, that means that resources are used wisely. And when I say transparent, that means the process is known up front and applied equally to all. And when I say orderly, this means that since development has to occur in an orderly manner, so should the allocation of capacity. A further intent of the recommended policy framework is to prioritize allocation to those projects that provide the greatest benefit to the town. And as you will hear later in this presentation, this is proposed to occur through a merit-based system. And lastly, a further intent is to establish a process that clearly identifies when and for how long allocation is given, with the goal being the addition of fairness and predictability to the process of capacity allocation. And again, given the finite nature of the resource, at least in the short term, this is very important. Once the allocation policy has been approved by council, it will affect all future decisions on development. And I will explain in a few moments what development will be the subject of the policy. And secondly, it will apply to those who have received exemptions to the current interim control bylaw, but have not proceeded to building permit by the time the council policy has been, or the allocation policy has been approved by council. And this means that those who have already received exemptions will be subject to the policy if they have not applied for and obtained a building permit when the policy is adopted by council. Next slide. So what the policy document does, it does a number of things. It identifies what the unit of measure is for allocating capacity. This sounds very technical, but engineers have a way of figuring out how much water and sewage is used in typical households and in other types of land uses, and then they create equivalencies to ensure that it can be measured in some way going forward. And in the town of Collingwood, that's called a single dwelling unit equivalent, or in short, SDU. So you might hear me say SDU a couple of times in the presentation, and that's what that means. The allocation document also identifies what development is and is not subject to the policy itself. And this of course is key to understanding what development can proceed without having to apply the policy. The document also identifies when allocation is given and when it will expire. In other words, at what point in the planning process, which often involves many decision points. And I'll talk about what those are in a moment, should allocation be given. How to deal with existing approvals is another subject matter, always a consideration since there are many of them in the town. The criteria that will be relied upon to make decisions is included in the document as well, with this being a key element of the policy. The document also deals with how allocation will be monitored and tracked to make sure that the allocation is being used wisely. And then it discusses other implementation mechanisms that will need to be considered, such as updates to the zoning bylaw, for example. Next slide. So what this slide does, it identifies proposed short-term and long-term exemptions. And the short-term exemptions we've identified at this point are the following. Firstly, construction of 2 additional residential units on a property. That's a Planning Act term, but these types of units are otherwise known as basement apartments, secondary suites, and so on. So those would be exempted provided there were no more than 2 additional being created. Secondly, lot additions where land is being added from one lot and added to another. While this rarely occurs, it does happen. And we are trying to consider every type of application and development through this process. Changes of use that do not increase usage or flows. And when I say usage, that means water usage, or flows is sewage flows. And in this regard, examples may include going from an office to a retail store, but of course it would not include an office going to a restaurant obviously because the restaurant uses much more services than an office would. Decks, patios, accessory buildings, temporary buildings, and renovations would also be exempted, which is currently the case in the interim control bylaw. The repair, rebuilding, and restoration of existing buildings would also be exempted as well. In addition, after the plant is expanded in 2025, 2026, the following additional exemptions could be considered. Any other development that results in an increase of less than 3 SDUs. And the development of 1 to 3 dwelling units on a vacant lot. Other exemptions could also be identified. So this brings us to our second polling question, question 2, which I will read. To what extent do you agree that an exemption should apply for up to 2 secondary residential units, such as accessory apartment, coach house, and other types of accessory dwelling units on a property? Strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, and don't know.
And everybody, Glenn here, just so we're all on the same page, we all recognize that this survey is indicative in nature. It's not generalizable. We're not pretending this is a statistically accurate survey. It's just to get a snapshot of what people in this particular meeting are thinking about the issue. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. Nick, back to you.
Okay, that's great. Always good to say it's not a vote. We're just looking for input on some of the things we're talking about today. We've got about 60% participation. It looks like out of the gate that most people strongly agree or agree with the exemption that would allow for additional residential units to be developed without having to go through the policy. Okay, that's great. Thanks for that. That's very helpful. Next slide. So this slide sets out what development would be the actual subject of the policy. So that includes any development where an extension of linear water and or wastewater services is required. This is where the road has got to be torn up to put in pipes to extend to a property on which there is nothing or something on private services. And this would be included because additional water usage and sewage flow will occur as a result. Secondly, the development of 4 or more dwelling units on a single property would be subject to the policy. And this would be the case when the long-term exemption comes into effect, But until then, the development of additional dwelling units, except secondary suites, would be subject to the policy. The creation of any number of new lots or units through the plan of subdivision, vacant land condominium description, or consent to sever or part lot control processes. That sounds very complicated, but each of these processes results in the creation of new lots on which houses can be built, or new units within a plan of condominium. Any development requiring an official plan and or zoning bylaw amendment, again, if the usage and flows increase, of course, unless exempt, and an example would be such as a residence changing into a restaurant. Any development requiring site plan approval, and for those who are not aware, site plan approval is a process whereby someone applies to develop a property and an agreement is entered into with the town on how that property will be developed, with that agreement dealing with where the building is, where the landscaping is, where the parking is, and so on. And then lastly, any other development that results in an increase of 4 or more SDUs to cover off anything that we haven't already thought of. Next slide. So here's some detail with respect to plans of subdivision and vacant land condominium. So what we're proposing for these types of developments is that allocation would be given at draft plan approval. So when someone applies for a plan of subdivision, the first approval they get is draft plan approval. And once the conditions of draft plan approval are satisfied, then the plan is registered. And it's only after a plan is registered that the construction of homes and the sale of properties and homes can occur. So what we're suggesting is that the allocation be given at the draft plan approval stage. And once the draft plan is draft plan approved, it must then be registered within 24 months or the allocation is withdrawn. The extension of allocation for draft approved plans for an additional 12 months may be considered, provided some progress is made in clearing conditions, such as completion and acceptance of servicing and grading plans, for example. The draft plan may be extended once for 1 year beyond the 3-year period that draft plans are draft approved for. When draft plan is actually registered, building permits for at least 75% of the lots have to be issued within 3 years. The allocations would generally be given in phases, which is up to 100 SDUs in each. And that's to ensure that one developer doesn't have all of the capacity in the town, thereby not allowing other development to proceed. And then each phase would require 75%.
Just wondering, did we just lose Nick? Oh, Nick, are you back?
I've always been here.
Okay, I think you froze for a moment, or at least you did on my screen. You might want to just repeat the last 30 seconds or so of what you said.
Okay, that's fine. I'm also going to change my AirPods.
Okay, we'll give Nick a moment to do that.
All right, do you hear me now, Glenn?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead, Nick. Thank you.
I guess in this Zoom world, technical difficulties sometimes arise. So I think the last 3 points I'll go over again. So the allocation would be generally given in phases, which is up to 100 SDUs in each. And each phase would require 75% completion. There would be a holding symbol applied as a condition of draft plan approval. And the subdivision agreement would require the deposit of securities for water and wastewater component of the development charge. So this brings us to our third polling question, question 3, which I will read. And in your view, should capacity for plans of subdivision vacant land condominium be allocated when draft approval is given, which is what is currently recommended? Should it be given at the agreement or registration stage? Neither, or don't know? Great, folks are answering the question, which is great. There's a few don't knows, and that's understandable given that most of the participants this evening are not planners or developers or lawyers, and that's fair. But it does look like most of the folks on the call this evening are suggesting that the draft plan approval point in the process is the one where when allocation should be given. Okay, that's great. Thanks for that information. We'll move on to the next slide. Okay, the other types of applications the town deals with include site plan approval, and in this particular case, any development requiring site plan approval would be subject to the policy. We're suggesting allocation be given at the time of execution and registration of the site plan agreement, and the development must be commenced in 24 months or the allocation withdrawn, very similar to the draft plan process. Extensions may be considered, provided there's some progress to developing the property. Allocation, again, would generally be given in phases, up to 100 SDUs in each. Holding symbol would again be applied, and then the site plan agreement would require securities for the water and wastewater component of the development chart. So very similar to the subdivision process. Next slide. So consent to sever, that's a circumstance where someone applies to create one or two lots from an existing lot. It's a simpler process. The same things need to be considered as would be for a plan of subdivision, but it is a simpler process. In this particular case, for this type of minor development, the allocation would be given at the time of provisional consent. The conditions would be required to be fulfilled within 1 year, or 2 when the Planning Act is updated. If conditions are not fulfilled, the consent is deemed to be refused. If the conditions are fulfilled and the lot is created, development must be commenced in 36 months or the allocation is withdrawn. A holding symbol would also be applied. In those cases where development only requires an official plan amendment and or zoning bylaw amendment, but does not require a subdivision approval or a consent or a site plan process, in those cases, the owner would be required to enter into an agreement, and then again, the allocation only available for 3 years. Next slide, please. We also have a number of existing approvals to consider, and there are many in the town of Collingwood, which has seen an uptick in applications and interest. So as mentioned, all development in the town will be the subject of the policy. The town will be reviewing the status of each existing approval in terms of where it is in the process. Is it shovel ready or not? What is the scale of development? Is it minor? Is it major? There will be a determination made on whether allocation should be confirmed in accordance with the policy, and that would be a yes, no. And if the answer is no, existing conditions of approval may be modified and or holding provisions applied to protect the town's interest and to ensure that adequate servicing is available at the right time. There are also about 300 existing small vacant lots of record in the town. They're currently not eligible for development according to the interim control bylaw. They would not be eligible if the zoning bylaw is amended as I am recommending, and this will be discussed on a later slide. And of course, if the zoning bylaw is amended as recommended, it would provide the opportunity to apply the capacity allocation policy to all development in the town. And because there are so many existing vacant lots in the town, we have come up with our 4th polling question, question 4, which I'll read. And this one goes as follows. Which of the following would be your preferred approach to allocate capacity to existing small lots? Firstly, by evaluating proposals against the full merit-based criteria in the capacity allocation policy, and that's what we're currently recommending. Secondly, by evaluating proposals against a shortened version of the merit-based criteria. Thirdly, by setting aside a certain percentage of capacity each year and allocating it on a first come, first served basis. And this would involve, for example, setting aside 30 SDUs, I'm just picking a number out of the air, and reserving that for these types of developments. Or lastly, don't know. And I see the folks are answering the question. That's great. It looks like most folks think that setting aside a certain percentage of capacity each year makes the most sense, but a close second would be putting these types of developments through the full merit-based criteria process as well. So food for thought for the team as we go forward. Great, thanks a lot. So the key element of the allocation policy we've created in draft form for discussion this evening is the establishment of a merit-based approach to allocating services. And in this regard, and to be considered for allocation, the proposed development must conform to the official plan and zoning bylaw, or will as a condition of approval. I think that goes without saying. The developer must have addressed all town and agency comments, or will as a condition of approval. And then lastly, and this is important, development must achieve 75% of the available points in the evaluation criteria that I will slowly unpack. Next slide. So this slide identifies the categories we have come up with in the draft policy and the number of points assigned to each. And so the buckets we've come up with are efficient use of land and orderly development, 20 points, conservation and sustainable development, 20, infrastructure, public facilities, 10, economic development, 10, attainable housing, 20, community impact benefits, 5, timing of development, 15 points. So there are a number of individual criteria within each of these buckets that are not being presented on the slides, but I'll provide a very brief overview of them. So within the efficient use of land and orderly development, some of the criteria we've identified are the lands within the built boundary, which is the area in the town where intensification is to be directed. And that's a yes, no answer. And if it's yes, you get points for that. Does a development include a mix of land uses, especially those that provide for live-work arrangements? Does a development represent an orderly and sequential expansion of the community outward from the existing built-up area? Is a development transit supportive? Does a development facilitate the development of a brownfield site? So these are all yes, nos, and you get points if the answer is yes. So that's an example of how the criteria have been established. In the conservation and sustainable development bucket, we've identified 4 different criteria. So firstly, development incorporates low impact sustainable development as it relates particularly to water efficiency, which is an issue in the town. Development will achieve LEED, Energy Star, or other similar certification. That's another one. Development will incorporate green development standards. And fourthly, development facilitates the transfer of natural heritage lands into public ownership or land trust. So some of these are degree of compliance and others are yes, no, but these are the criteria we've come up with in draft again. Within the infrastructure and public facilities bucket, we've got a couple of criteria. So the first is, does a development complete a key element of infrastructure that's missing within an area, such as facilitating road connections that are needed and have been planned for some time, and that's an example. Does the development facilitate the provision of public facilities beyond those that are required under legislation by the developer? And again, both of these would be degree of compliance, and then points are assigned as a consequence. Under the economic development bucket, we've got 2 criteria. One that deals with job creation. Are jobs being created as a component of the development, and points are assigned based on the number of jobs that are being created. And secondly, does a development enhance the downtown or a main street as a focal point of activity and commerce? Again, with the focus being on development being located in those areas, receiving points against those that are not. Attainable housing is the next bucket. That's also an important factor or consideration in the town. So does the development include affordable housing units? And points are assigned if it does. Does the development propose innovative housing solutions? Does it include rental housing? Does it provide housing for seniors, community or special needs? And does the development include a mix of uses? And points are assigned based on degree of compliance or whether it's a yes or no, depending on the criteria. Community impacts and benefits, we've come up with a couple. The application preserves sites, buildings of historical interest, or the development will facilitate the removal or improvement of a land use conflict, and points are assigned again. And then lastly, timing of development, which is always an important consideration. And the key criteria in that bucket is the extent to which development is shovel ready. And to a very large extent, the town looked at what developments were shovel ready when they considered exemptions to the current interim control bylaw that's in place. So this brings us to the fifth polling question, which has to do with the level of emphasis that should be placed on each of the categories identified in making decisions. So for example, in our recommendations, we have placed greater emphasis on efficient use of land and orderly development, conservation and sustainable development, and attainable housing. And we've done this because we think at this point that these are the most important. However, we're looking for your views on this. So here's question 5. So in this question, we're asking you to pick the top 3 in your mind on which emphasis should be placed in applying the merit-based criteria. So the 7 buckets are on this list, and I see folks are already answering the question. So I'll wait and see where we end up.
And Nick, it's Glenn here. I'll just add, for those of you who may be looking at this on a smaller communication device like a phone, you might want to just make sure you scroll down so that you see all of the options. Timing of development will be the one at the bottom of the list. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. Looks like 3/4 have responded, and I think I'll wait a couple of seconds, I mean. So it looks like the top 3 are going to be attainable housing. Attainable housing looks like it's number 1, not surprising. Conservation, sustainable development, and efficient use of land and orderly development are the other 2. So those are the same 3 that we've placed greater emphasis on as well. However, some others have been identified, including infrastructure and public facilities and community impacts and benefits. Okay, that's great. Thanks for that information. Okay, we'll move on to the, oh, sorry, we do have a second question on this as well, which is question 6. And at present, we're suggesting that a minimum overall score be attained to be considered, and that was 75% of the total points available. And this recognizes that not all development will check the boxes, so to speak. So in the alternative, to what extent do you agree that a minimum score be achieved in each category instead of the overall of the merit-based criteria? And the possible answers are strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, and don't know. Looks like strongly disagree is in the lead, so to speak, but the strongly agree is also not too far behind. So we've got some folks with different opinions on this point. Again, food for thought for us as we move forward. We certainly heard a lot about this in the afternoon session with the developers, and I should say that they were quite concerned in some cases about how the merit-based criteria would work as it related to attaining the 75% of the points available. So thanks for this. We'll move on. So a few other things we're also recommending as part of this process. One of them deals with the town's zoning bylaw. So at the present time, the town's zoning bylaw does not include a provision that requires that water and wastewater services be available when building permits are applied for. This means that there is no legal way to not issue a building permit, since there would be no applicable law that would prevent this from occurring. That kind of sounds legalese, and I get that. But when building permits are applied for under the Ontario Building Code, a chief building official is required to issue that permit unless there is some law that says a permit cannot be issued. And one of those potential laws is a zoning bylaw. So with that in mind, it is recommended that the town's bylaw be amended as per the Planning Act by adding in a new section that's on this page that basically says, notwithstanding any other provision in the bylaw, the use of land, the use of any land, building, or structure, or the erection or use of buildings or structures is not permitted unless municipal water and wastewater services are available to service the use, building, or structure. If the bylaw is amended, as we've recommended, the provision will allow the chief building official to not issue a permit if services are not available. If this provision is also included, I should also note, if the provision is included in the zoning bylaw as a product of this land use study and is appealed, the interim control bylaw would be extended until the appeal is dealt with, again, to protect the town's interests. Next slide. So with respect to the official plan, we've also developed a number of recommendations for consideration by the town. As some of you may be aware, the town is currently in the process of updating its official plan, and some of the things that we're recommending are already being considered. Having said that, we do recommend that the official plan be amended to ensure that growth management and infrastructure decisions are aligned, to indicate the town will develop a water and wastewater allocation policy framework to guide allocation decisions. However, with the detail of how those decisions are made left to the allocation policy document itself, to indicate that merit-based criteria may be considered, to indicate that the zoning bylaw be updated as recommended, and to allow for holding provisions to be utilized until servicing is available. However, changes to the official plan, in my view, are not required in the short term to establish a council-approved water and wastewater strategy, which is the plan, and to pass a zoning bylaw amendment as recommended. Next slide. So next steps, and this is the last slide for me. Timing is tight. We know that, but it is the town's wish to establish an appropriate allocation policy framework in an expeditious manner. So folks have 10 days for written submissions after today, meaning that your submissions should be in by December 3rd, 2021. We will then work very quickly to revise and update the policy document, and that will occur in early December. We would then meet with council in December, and we're targeting currently December 20th to present our recommendations. There would then be a public meeting in January under the Planning Act to deal with the zoning bylaw amendment recommendation, and then staff would be preparing to implement the allocation policy framework in the January to April time period. So with that being said, Glenn, that's the presentation. I hand it back to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Nick, for the informative overview of all of that information. There was a lot to cover there, and I'm sure people will have a few questions, and we'll get to those in a moment. So we've heard from the town, we've heard from the planning consultant. Now it's time to hear from our session participants. And I'll note, and I will show you in a minute, that there are a series of questions that the town would like to get your thoughts on. There are 5 of them. We'll put them up in a minute, but again, the town would love to get your comments and answers to those questions. But in addition, of course, we'll open it up to your questions that you might want to ask, and any comments or observations you might want to share about the framework. And there's 2 ways that you can do that. You can share your thoughts in writing, and you can share them orally. So we see on screen right now, there's some instructions about how you can do it. If you prefer to again, send your comments, send your observations, send your questions or your answers to the town's questions in writing, you simply need to open the Q&A window. If you take your cursor and kind of toggle towards the bottom of the screen, you should see the Q&A icon. You just have to open that up. It'll open the box. You can then put in your comment or your question or your answer to the town's questions in the Q&A box and click send. Your answers may be read out loud. Your questions may be read out loud. Just wanted to let all of you know that. And should your questions or answers or comments not be addressed live during the session, be assured that they will be considered in the staff report. And of course, again, there are opportunities for you outside of this meeting to share questions and comments. They can be addressed post-session to staff. Now, if you'd like to share your thoughts orally, we've got another slide up now that gives you some instructions about how to do that. So again, if you wanted to respond to the questions or share your questions or share your comments about the framework, if you've joined by a computer or a tablet or a smartphone with screen capability, you can raise your hand by clicking the raise hand button or icon that's typically found at the bottom of your screen. Again, you just have to hover over it. If you're not seeing it, it should be there. And though it may vary depending on your device and whether you've accessed the meeting using the full Zoom program, the app, or the browser, again, you should see the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. If you're selected to speak at the appropriate time, the technical manager will invite you into the conversation and will ask you to unmute, and we will then all be able to hear you and what it is that you have to share. A couple of other things really quickly. I don't think this is the case, so I think I can skip over this. I don't believe we have anybody who has just joined by phone, but if you happen to be using, sometimes people use a phone and or a device. Just quickly, if you're trying to raise your hand and you're on the phone, you can do that by pressing *9, and then you would mute and unmute yourself by pressing *6. If you're selected to speak, again, please be sure to enable your microphone. That's different than muting and unmuting. You need to ensure that whatever device you're using has enabled your mic, and you can do that in the settings of your device, again, whatever that device might be. So I'm going to kind of skip a couple of things because I know we're at 7:25 and we're eager to get some of your thoughts about all of this. Once you are, by the way, finished sharing your question or comment, you'll be remuted and returned to being a meeting attendee so that you can continue to be part of the conversation. And of course, please remember to lower your hand once you've shared your question or your thoughts. If for some reason we are unable to hear you, if we lose the connection with you, we will unfortunately have to move on and go to the next person. But we invite you to reconnect using the Zoom link, and we will try to get you back in. So if I could just quickly ask on screen to put the 5 questions up. They are A through E. If you are going to respond to these questions in writing, I would invite you to put at the beginning of your response the question letter. So in other words, if you were responding to question B, which is, should the town include merit-based criteria addressing natural heritage protection, urban design, and or provision of active transportation infrastructure? Are there any other criteria missing? Just put, QB at the beginning, and then we'll know you're responding to question B. So again, you can share your questions and comments in writing. You can share them orally. All you have to do is raise your hand electronically. I won't read out all of the questions. I think, again, as I'm looking at the list, that all of you, it looks like, have screen capability. If you don't, let us know, and I am happy to read them, but I don't think I have to at this point. So I'm just checking. We should move now to hearing from all of you, and we'll sort of take people in the order that we see them. I think we have had a number of questions already come in through the written Q&A. I'm not actually seeing any raised hands at the moment where people can speak orally. So for the written questions, we have the community planner from the town of Collingwood, who is Nathan Wukash, who has been monitoring those for us. Nathan, maybe I can invite you to share a question or two to get the ball rolling. Nathan?
Sure, thank you, Glenn. Good evening, everybody. The first question is from Marg Shebanady. She asks, or she comments first, that the criteria mentioned about attainable housing needs some work. Will the Affordable Housing Committee be consulted in developing these? And secondly, where would social enterprises fit in the merit-based ranking?
Okay, so let's get Nick and/or Summer in. Thank you, Nathan, for sharing that on behalf of the participants. So will the Affordable Housing Committee be consulted? Go ahead. Summer, I think you were looking to unmute. Go ahead.
Thank you, Glenn. I can certainly respond to the first half of the question. Part of the communications for this meeting was to send out notice to all of the town committee and board. So hopefully the members of the Attainable Housing Task Force were able to attend should they wish this meeting. As we spoke, any individual, group, organization are welcome to provide comments in the next 10 days, or to contact either myself or community planner Nathan Wukash with their questions, comments, etc. And we'll provide that contact information at the end of the meeting again. In particular, Nathan has worked directly as a staff support to the Affordable Housing Task Force, excuse me. And certainly we can have him follow up with the task force if there's any specific feedback that they wish to provide, or if they would like to look more closely at those criteria.
Yeah, it sounded like from what Nathan said that they are looking for some further work to be done on those. So I think it would be good to get some of that input. Thank you. Nathan, give us another question, please.
Sure. Thank you, Glenn. The next question is regarding whether we can provide specific examples of other municipalities in Ontario where this merit system has been employed.
Okay, so let me ask Nick maybe to jump in on that one. Are there places, other jurisdictions where something like the approach that you've brought forward has been used or is being considered? Nick, go ahead.
Yes, that's very true. There are a number of other jurisdictions, and they're all identified within a best practices document that we have prepared. Do you hear me all right, Glenn?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. I had to check out there for a minute and come back in. I'm not sure, Summer, perhaps you can help us on whether that document is public or not, but there is quite a bit of information in there. Notable examples are the Township of King, the town of Newmarket, the city of Vaughan. They have all varying levels of detail that basically do the same thing. But what I can tell you is that what we've done in Collingwood does seem to go a little beyond what others have done as well. But I think that answers your question.
Thank you. And Nathan, are there other questions you could share?
Yeah, there's another related question from one of our attendees relating to the best practices. That person comments that they understand that a number of municipalities' land use policies were considered, and they ask if we can advise what review has been undertaken to determine the effectiveness of the respective policies and what evidence is there that what being proposed is in fact bona fide best practices.
That's a great question. I'm wondering if the one posing the question is a lawyer, because that's a great legal question. Well, I look at what other municipalities have done, and I've written official plans across my career. So I've written similar policies, and what I was looking for were innovative approaches to this particular issue, and approaches that made it very clear that there is a public interest to take into account when making these kinds of decisions. So the ones I've included in the best practices document, in my opinion, do reflect best practices, but I didn't look at all 400 municipalities in Ontario. There may be others out there that folks would like to share with us, and I'd be happy to take a look at them.
Thanks, Nick. By the way, again, everybody, I want to remind you, you're not limited to just sharing your questions and comments and answers through the written Q&A, though we're certainly appreciative of you doing so. If you would like to get into the conversation, again, please feel free to raise your hand electronically, and we'd be happy to invite you to speak. But again, you don't have to do that. You can use the written Q&A if that's your preference. Nick, questions are coming in through various means. Here's another one for you. I think it was somebody saying slide 11 said that the draft plan of subdivision may be extended once for 1 year. And they're asking, on what is the word may based? What criteria would be used to make that decision?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Typically, I guess what would happen is that you have to, let me back up. Developer has to apply to extend draft plan approval because it only applies for 3 years. And most municipalities look at that development and say, well, do the conditions that were initially identified, do they still work? Do they need to be amended? Do they need to be modified? So that's the first thing the town would do. Secondly, the town would look at the development and say, well, did it make sense for that development to be draft approved in the form it was draft approved? Because we have some new information that needs to be considered. And then lastly, with respect to servicing, we would need, I think the town would need to see some proof that progress was being made on clearing conditions and that some issue was identified in doing that prevented them from fulfilling that requirement within the 3-year period. It is quite common for draft plan approvals to be extended in Ontario. And I'm thinking that this provides an additional level of review to that process if it does occur.
Okay. Thank you. Summer, did you want to get in on this one?
I did actually want to quickly back up to the last two as well, Glenn, because they were both related to best practices, and there was questions about which municipalities were looked at and what type of system was in place for each of the 13 that Nick's team did explore. I wanted to just be sure that everyone watching tonight was aware that that document is publicly available. The easiest place to find it is on the Engage Collingwood website. Right up at the top, there's a summary of the most recent activities on this project. And as part of that, there's a link to the staff report. So it might not be evident, but the staff report is where you can find the full documents that Nick talked about today, as well as the best practice document. With respect to this most recent question, I would only add to what Nick was suggesting, in that when planners review requests to extend draft plan approvals, those extensions are reviewed against the policies and the planning policy framework in place at the time of the extension. So that does provide an opportunity for us to sort of improve upon the submission if necessary, get updated studies and documents so that the development still would meet the best and most recent and most current planning policy frameworks.
Great, thanks, Summer. I'm going to go back to Nathan in a moment, but there was a question this afternoon that I'm sure people would be interested in this evening, and maybe it's best put to Peggy Slama, who's the Director of Public Works and Engineering with the town of Collingwood. Peggy, people were interested in knowing how long the allocation policy would be in effect, and wouldn't it be lifted once the town increases its water and wastewater capacity? And, you know, roughly when did you imagine that would happen? Do you mind jumping in and speaking to that, Peggy?
Sure, thanks, Glenn. I can speak to the components that are related to the water treatment plant capacity limitations and the expansion. And I'll let Summer touch on some of the consideration on how long the allocation policy would remain in place. But currently, you know, the ICBL was approved by council because we do have some limitations on our current water treatment plant capacities, in particular during the winter season. And staff have been working diligently to advance the water treatment plant expansion over the last 6 months. And one of the first steps that council had asked us to move forward with was the implementation of additional disinfection that would allow us to regain our full winter capacity. So we have been able to advance that component of the project, and we are on schedule. And we should be seeing the implementation of some additional disinfection in place before the end of 2022. And that would restore our full available capacity at the water treatment plant, which is 31 megaliters a day. And it opens up a few more available SDUs until our water treatment plant expansion is complete. As for the larger expansion project, we are still on schedule, and we're looking to see that additional capacity will be online before the end of 2025. And when we're considering how we can phase the construction of our new plant expansion, we are expecting that the additional capacity will be available before the end of 2025, but that the construction of the water treatment plant expansion won't be fully complete until 6 months after that in 2026. But that for the first phase of the water treatment plant expansion, we were looking at 52 megaliters a day. So moving from 31 to 52 megaliters a day, and through some investigation and specifying certain requirements on the treatment processes, we are now looking at a 58 megaliter a day phase 1 expansion for our water treatment plant. So some of that would become available before the end of 2025. And so Summer, do you want to touch on the allocation component? I will say that, today we're seeing some limitations on the water side, but we are very cognizant that, having this allocation policy in place is a way for us to manage available capacity into the future, and it will include wastewater allocation. And we expect in the next 10 years to be looking at an expansion of our wastewater treatment plant. And so it is some due diligence and good best practice to be, making sure we're managing our allocations and not getting into a similar situation on the wastewater side in the future.
Okay, thanks, Peggy. So yeah, Summer, jump in. How long do you imagine this allocation policy would be in effect for?
I think Peggy stole the words out of my mouth, as that this is intended to be a long-standing document, not to suggest that it wouldn't change and evolve over the years as we collectively implement it and the landscape changes within what is limited, if anything, with respect to water or wastewater capacity. So it is intended to be a document that's continues to be in place at the town of Collingwood at the will of council. And also a reminder that water and wastewater infrastructure is quite an investment for a community. So there's always benefits to ensuring that we're using that investment wisely and judiciously, and this policy does help us with that. The one piece that I would highlight, and this is the way the draft policy is set up now, so that could change, is that the sunset clauses, how and when capacity is allocated, what tools we use to control capacity through the planning process, that is all intended to be in effect irrespective of whether capacity is limited or not. The merit-based criteria, however, do kick in when capacity is limited or where there are competing projects for limited capacity within the system. So that is the one difference that I would highlight, and that's how the policy is worded today, but happy to receive comments from the group or later on in writing about that matter as well.
Okay, thank you. So let's go back to Nathan. And I know you've got a few other questions to share. Nathan, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. There are a few questions here. The first is a technical one that I'll respond to, and it was about a transcript of this meeting. So the video recording of this meeting and the PowerPoint presentation will all be posted on our Engage page as well. So please stay tuned for that, and you can review the materials that you've seen today. The next question is from Emma Baker, and she asks if we can clarify if there's a single lot and want to build a pair of semi-detached homes with accessory apartments in each. Is this being more than 3 SDUs? Would that be exempt based on the exemption policy?
And Nathan, did you say a pair of semi-detached homes? Is that what?
Yeah, that's what the question is. So
okay.
I presume that to mean 2 semi-detached homes with an accessory apartment in each, so 4 total dwelling units.
Okay, well, let's get Nick in on that. So would this apply to that? What's the situation, Nick?
Yeah, so in that kind of circumstance, the policy would apply. At the present time, we're suggesting that only additional residential units or secondary suites be exempted. So semis would not be additional residential units. Over the longer term, after the plant is expanded, the potential exists for those types of developments to also be exempted, but we're not suggesting at this point that they be exempted.
Thank you. Nathan, any other questions, or should we start to share some of the responses to the town's questions?
Yeah, there are two more questions that we can pose to the panel.
Great, let's tackle them.
The first is there a risk that the point system will stall development in Collingwood and further push up the prices of existing resales?
That's a great question. I don't think so. The point system is designed to ensure that a finite resource in the short term is allocated in a manner that really benefits the town. So I don't see it having an impact in the short term or longer term.
Thank you, Nick. The next question is related as well to the housing market. It comes from Jamie, who has a concern about the amount of Airbnbs in Collingwood that are basically taking rental housing out of the market. And Jamie asks, is there any way that more points could be given to projects that would allow for apartment or dwellings in which local people could move into as permanent homes for 1 or 2 year leases?
So I guess the point system does take that into account by including rental housing as a criteria. So if rental housing is being provided, points are given. If there are innovative housing forms proposed, points are given for that as well. In terms of local and non-local, we can't really get into that because we can't control who lives in the house. We can just control where the house is built and what it looks like. And I guess with that all being said, if there is any room for improvement in how we've dealt with that in the criteria, we're certainly more than open to hearing your thoughts.
And Nick, I'm noting again through the Q&A that somebody has commented, and I don't think to be critical of you, just an observation, that what you were describing sounds like it could be an approach that is maybe more appropriate for a larger urban center like Toronto and so forth. And are you sure that this kind of, and I'm paraphrasing here, but that this kind of approach is appropriate for the town of Collingwood, where the density and the demand and the zoning and so forth are different? Like, are you feeling confident that this is right for Collingwood given its size and circumstances?
It's absolutely right for Collingwood. Collingwood's on the cusp of additional growth. It will be growing at a faster rate than at any time in its history going forward. And establishing these kinds of policies to guide growth and to make sure growth happens in the right places and at the right time is absolutely appropriate for the town. These types of criteria are used by all kinds of municipalities in Ontario, large and small. The issues are always the same. It's to make sure growth occurs where it should be occurring and to get the best benefit from that growth for the broader public interest.
And Nick, there was a question, why aren't changes to the town's official plan required to implement the proposed water and wastewater strategy? I know you touched on that. Can you give us any more detail?
Certainly. So the water and wastewater strategy that we're talking about today is a council document, which doesn't require an official plan to enable it to pass. To be very simple about it, council passes all kinds of documents and policies that govern how the municipality operates from a whole number of perspectives. And in this particular case, this is another example of such an operational guide, if I can call it that way, where council is making a determination on how a resource they control, which is water and wastewater, is allocated in a manner that best benefits the town. So in my view, official plan policies are not required to enable that kind of policy to be implemented.
Okay, and just a heads up to Nathan, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, in particular, if you wouldn't mind sharing some of the responses we're seeing to questions A through E that the town has posed. But just before I do that, and maybe again, this is to Nick and or Summer, I think some people are wondering how you arrived at the draft points allocation scoring system. So why more points for some things, less points for others? How did you go about developing that?
That's a great question, and I think I did touch upon that in the presentation. We did create a number of categories and then criteria within each of those categories, and we placed a certain amount of emphasis on things like attainable housing and orderly development, and less emphasis on other aspects of it. So what I've done is basically recommended what I think works or could work for Collingwood. And what we're doing today is getting feedback on that and seeing if it resonates with Collingwood residents and developers. And we're certainly open to any suggestions on how the merit-based criteria can be reworked or reworded, or how the points are actually allocated. And in that manner, I guess in that vein, there were concerns raised this afternoon about it perhaps not being possible to attain 75% for most of the developments that may be proposed. So that's obviously something we need to think about. And it may mean some rejigging of the criteria themselves, and perhaps a reallocation of some of the points too, to ensure that it's workable. It's a first draft. That's why we're out here tonight to get your comments on it.
Thank you, Nick. So everybody, we're moving into the last 10 minutes or so of the meeting. So again, I wanted to respectfully invite you, if you are planning to raise your hand electronically and want to get into the conversation orally, you should do so now. Actually, I'm seeing we have one individual. So I'm going to go there, Nathan, now before I invite you to share some of the responses to the questions. So my apologies if I butcher the name, but I am seeing well, Marg is the first name. I think I got that part right. So Marg, we're going to invite you to join into the conversation. If you would kindly unmute and go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Glenn. Just want to say, first of all, excellent facilitation and the poll questions and everything else. This worked really well.
Well, it's very kind of you. Thank you. We appreciate that.
Well, thank you.
Go ahead, please.
You know, after what I feel was a gross misstep in calculations that even led us to this point, after listening to Nick's presentation, I feel like maybe it's a blessing in disguise. What I'm seeing here is just such a huge and bold departure from the way we have done things in the past that go well beyond just allocation. I mean, it's including a greater vision for how our community unfolds. I hope that doesn't get hijacked by some special interests, but I just want to say kudos to Nick. I think it's an excellent direction and it's got me really excited. And Nathan can tell you not a lot gets me feeling that excited. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Nick, yeah, kudos to you. Any response, Nick? Go ahead, please.
No, thanks for those comments. Really appreciate it. I'm used to hearing more negative comments than positive. So getting a positive comment once in a while is great too.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Again, anybody else as we move into our last few minutes? And Nathan, let me invite you back in. Is there anything you wanted to share quickly that you're seeing again through the written Q&A, either questions and or answers to some of the questions that the town has posed? Go ahead, Nathan.
Sure. Thank you, Glenn. Yeah, we had one respondent that participated and answered our questions and basically answered yes to all of the questions that the town had posed. So I'd like to encourage everybody else to participate if you haven't done so yet. We would really appreciate hearing your feedback on the questions, the 5 questions that are on the screen right now. And if you could post those in the Q&A, we would greatly appreciate that. We do have 2 comments or questions from an attendee that I'll kind of paraphrase here as well for the panel. The person is basically asking questions about the merit-based points model and wondering whether all the work done on existing projects over the past 2 to 5 years has been wasted now if it doesn't fit within the merit-based criteria. And also kind of supplemental to that, they ask how many development projects fit in the merit-based criteria now.
Okay. So Nick or Summer, jump in. Has that work been lost if those past projects don't fit? And secondly, how many projects do you anticipate will fit into the criteria and attain the desired or needed number of points? Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, so the work completed in the last 2 to 5 years is absolutely not wasted. All of that is good work. The town needed to do something like this to essentially rationalize how it was going to allocate a finite resource. This had to happen because if it didn't happen through this process, it would be very difficult to ensure that everyone had the water supply that they already have guaranteed. So that was a significant issue to deal with. So I don't think the time has been wasted. With respect to the second question, we will be, town staff will be looking at existing applications over the next few months to determine how they fit or not fit within the merit-based system that we're suggesting. So we don't have an answer to that right now. We're certainly aware that the development community is already applying this system to their developments and are already making submissions to us on how the system can be improved to deal with a number of matters. So this is certainly a fluid issue and something that we are going to continue working on.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So everybody, we're into our last 5 minutes. I'll echo what Nathan just said. If you haven't already, please take a moment to answer any of those 5 questions. Again, you can do that through the written Q&A function of Zoom. While you're thinking about those and perhaps typing your responses, and just before I formally draw things to a close, I'll invite Summer Valentine, again, the town's Director of Planning, Building, and Economic Development, to reiterate some of the next steps and also share any summative observations that she might have. Summer, over to you.
Thank you. If we could advance to the last slide, that would be great. Perfect. So we'll take the opportunity with the closing minutes here to draw everyone's attention to 2 important dates. So as mentioned at the outset, we're welcoming written comments for the next 10 days up to December 3rd. And you can submit those either through planning@collingwood.ca or through the Engage Collingwood website. And as mentioned, this presentation will be posted on the Engage Collingwood website, so you're able to access this contact information if you're trying to busily scribble it down and don't feel like you'll get it down in time. The other date is December 20th, which is our target date to come back to council with the final recommendations around the land use planning policy study. There might be some flexibility around that date, but in particular for the zoning component, we are looking to hit that as a return to council to continue this discussion. If you do have any additional questions, your questions weren't answered today, you have a site-specific question, or you were just too shy to speak up, please do reach out to us. The first contact would be Community Planner Wukash, who joined us today, and his phone number and email are on the slide. Other than that, I would just like to take the opportunity, Glenn, to thank again the participants that took the time to share their thoughts with us, and we look forward to reviewing any additional comments in writing and answering questions by phone or email that you may have. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Summer. So everybody, just give me 30 seconds here. I also want to thank everyone for participating. A special thank you to those who shared their responses and their comments and their questions. This project obviously invites a lot of interest, and thank you for the very respectful meeting that we had this evening. I think you've given the town a lot to think about. I'd also like to thank again our elected officials who joined us this evening, not only for their interest in this very important initiative and topic, but also for their ongoing and very much valued service to the community. And it's, from my perspective, it's been a real pleasure working with such a thoughtful and knowledgeable group. So thank you again for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom. I'll now formally adjourn this session. Thank you to the various technical personnel and others who made the session possible. And thank you again to all of you for your participation. Please enjoy what's left in the rest of your evening, which isn't a ton of time, but do take care, stay safe, and goodbye for now.